Good evening.
Good evening.
And welcome to everyone who is also joining us on the internet. We will begin this evening with a section entitled Special Principles of Miracle Workers, found on page 27 in the second edition and on page 23 of the first edition. This section, in my original dictation to Helen, came now. In other words, it followed what we finished reading last week. And as I said when we skipped it, you will find that it has much more meaning at this point than if we had read it in the sequence you find it in the second and first editions. Now, before we begin, I want to present two ideas. What if there's only one altar? We have been talking about turning toward the altar, going within and turning toward the altar. And I would be willing to bet that all of you thought you were turning to an altar somewhere in the center of you, and that therefore there were as many altars as there were individuals turning within. What if there's only one altar? And the altar you're turning to when you go within is that one altar. It's sort of like the illustration of the diamond that I've used in the past, where each of you could be considered facets of the diamond. If you are looking out from the diamond, you can see that there are other facets adjoining you that seem quite independent of you, having a distinct shape of their own and so on, all capable of refracting the light. But communication is difficult because you have to bridge the line separating the facets. And you have to somehow communicate around the outer surface of the diamond. But if, as the facet, you look toward the interior of the diamond, you find that the whole diamond is you. And you find that every other facet, every other individuality as the facet looking toward the interior, finds that the whole diamond is what constitutes them, including you. There's only one interior. And in that interior, you are all one. Having, you might say, a little bit of the surface area of the diamond specifically identifying you. And in a way, you can extrapolate from this the meaning of being specific and universal at the same time, because you are all universal and specific simultaneously. So now if you're all turning toward the same altar, because there's only one altar, the very fact that you're turning toward the altar means you're turning toward each other. You see that? The very act of turning toward the altar means that you are all moving into the space where you are one. Now I know that after listening to me for some length of time, or any length of time, you know that turning toward the altar is what you are doing when you turn toward your guide, or toward the Holy Spirit, or toward the Father, asking for guidance. But now you have the added perspective that all the rest of you are available to each other, to you, along with your guide, and along with the Holy Spirit. And that space, if you will, the interior of the diamond, where the one altar is where you're already one, where you're already available to each other to perceive as the Christ that you are. It's where communion with each other can occur. So I just wanted to add that little bit of information so that you might be able to contemplate it and abide with it. It doesn't matter where any individuality is on your globe. It doesn't matter where any individuality is in the whole of creation. All of those individualities are available to you as some aspect of the infinitude of your being when you are turning toward the altar, and that's where real communion can occur. That's where you can see each other as you are and connect with each other on that basis. And you will find that when you connect with each other from there, you will appear to communicate with each other in the world. So once again, this isn't a matter of withdrawing from the world and going into some private mental space where you have a private conversation mentally with your brothers and sisters. It's going to look like something. Mind, every aspect of capital M mind is a conscious experience and is therefore a manifested experience. There is visibility and tangibility to it, and it's called creation. And so going within to gather from the Father His perspective of your brother or sister, so that you might experience a miracle, a sudden shift of perception that allows you to love your brother from the gifted perspective that you find yourself filled up with, is healing. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about is this. When you are facing away from the altar, you experience what I'm going to call the fourth dimensional conscious experience of being as though it is a three-dimensional only universe. Cause arises from the fourth dimensional conscious experience of being and is infinitely manifest. But if you deprive yourself of the Father's perspective, which is fourth dimensional, in other words, whole, all-inclusive, you experience the infinitude of creation as though it's external to you, and as though it's self-existent, and as I said last week and the week before, when your back is to the altar, everything you see is seen through the lens of fear. And so this three-dimensional universe that you see appears to be fearsome, and you become locked into a defensive stance toward it. You are suffering from ignorance of what it is, and in the ignorance of what it is, you give it definition yourself. But all your definitions amount to are beliefs. In the minute you create a belief, you also create, quote, the believer, unquote. There is no believer. There's only the Son of God, the daughter of God. But the moment you create a belief, you necessarily create a believer, and then you begin to think that's who you are, the believer of what you're believing. Now, I'm bringing this up for a very important reason, and that is that when correction occurs, which means healing, it is absolutely essential for the belief to be separated from the Christ that seems to be suffering from the belief. And so, we will pick the obvious example. I will pick two obvious examples of how correction can occur. You have an individuality by the name of Saddam Hussein. You also have an individuality by the name of George W. Bush. There are other individuals on the stage at the moment. And depending upon your point of view, the two individuals I have named are considered evil men. But if you're going to see correction occur, healing occur, you're going to have to separate the belief that they are evil men or the belief of evilness from the individuality known as George Bush and the individuality known as Saddam Hussein. If you do not make that distinction, we were talking about distinction last week. If you do not make that distinction, then you will proceed to get rid of evil men. And there's no correction in that. And who's the deluded one? You. Now, that doesn't mean that correction doesn't need to occur. But understand that the way correction occurs is when you distinguish between the Christ and whatever belief that Christ happens to have succumbed to, that is causing his perspective to be fearful and defensive, and who finds force to be the only way to survive. Now, this applies equally to cancer, or any disease, or any sin that any of you might be suffering from, or any of your friends might be. Don't say, "Oh, that poor soul." Say, "There's no poor soul there. There's the Christ." What they're suffering from is a belief. The belief is nothing more than magic, and the effects of that magic are nothing more than illusion. They are not real, and they have nothing whatsoever to do with that individuality who is the Christ. Now, this you can do intellectually, consciously and intellectually. Having done it, you can then, without bias, go within to ask God, what needs to be known here? What is the healing element here that will transform the appearance of a Christ suffering from ignorance? How can I approach this Christ with peace and with love that will illuminate the Christ of that one, reminding him or her of the truth about himself or herself? And it won't be quite so difficult as it is if you say, "He's an evil bastard. God, help me forgive him for his awfulness." You see, you're the one projecting the awfulness onto him. You're adding that. That's a job to overcome, to have God help you overcome the awfulness of his evilness, which is a definition you've provided. It's much easier to recognize that the belief and the believer are both illusions, and that right where a believer believing a belief that he's suffering from seems to be is the unalterable, unchangeable, eternal Christ. If you recognize that, even just intellectually, you will find that you have the means to approach and address this one in your mind with genuine love and genuine caring. And in extending that to him or her, you know what you do? You claim that as being the truth about you. And you will not be so ready to succumb to your beliefs without separating them from yourself and recognizing that no matter what beliefs you are believing, you are neither the believer or the belief. You are the Christ, the direct and present expression of God that cannot in any way be altered in the slightest from what God is being right where you are. It is this separation that allows for healing. You see, it's very easy to look at others, especially in the new age, and say, well, he's created it for himself. You see, you're saying that all that's there is a believer, believing a belief. You see, no possibility of healing there. And if you approach that one as though he is a believer, having a belief, that he needs to get rid of, so he's believes something new that's more spiritual, you're still dealing with a believer. You've never cut through to the spiritual fact of him that he's the Christ, absolutely incapable of ever having become a believer with a belief that he's suffering from. Now, I don't mean for this to sound intellectually complicated, but if you get this, it will be much easier for you to be miracle ready. And it's closer to being miracle minded. And it lays the way for a sudden shift of perception to occur much more easily. You see? If you want to experience a time collapse where there's instantaneous healing, you're going to have to approach the one needing healing, whether it's yourself or another, with some way to cut through the confusion that keeps the bondage in place. And when you realize that what will cut through it is the recognition that the belief that this other one is suffering from is being entertained by a non-existent presence called a believer, who is actually the Christ, temporarily unconscious of his Christhood, then you will forget about the belief. You will forget about whether that one has created it for himself and deserves the consequences he or she is experiencing, and you will address your attention to the Christ that is there. And what happens? You negate the belief, the believer, and the suffering, the consequences. And there's a time collapse. And you have what is called an instantaneous healing, or which you call a sudden shift of perception. What cuts through it is the capacity to recognize another's innocence, primitive innocence, primordial innocence, innocence from the beginning that could never be altered. You hear that there is an evil axis in your world. Ooh. And you have the leaders of the three countries that constitute the evil axis, and they are evil. Wow. Well, you better get it straight right now. All three of them are the Christ. All three of them are the direct expression and embodiment of God, or Allah, or whatever name is used to identify the original and omnipotent creator of existence. They are all right now the Christ. And they are innocent. Their innocence is part of the very embodiment of them that God is embodying at every moment, just like He is embodying it in you in every moment. And so, you have to be practical, and you have to disallow acts of harm. Sort of the same way you would restrain someone who was delirious and flailing. But you would not believe that you were restraining evil. You would just be restraining behavior arising out of misunderstanding, out of beliefs that were acquired while one's back was to the altar, while one wasn't listening for God to reveal His perception, His perspective, His vision of His creation as it truly is. So you restrain those whose inarticulate and awkward expression of existence would bring harm, while not believing for a moment that they are evil. You separate the belief and the believer from the individuality. You acknowledge who and what the individuality can only be, and you love that. And you let God fill you with the means to convey, to embody, to express the love that God instills in you, not that you figure out with your best judgment will probably be the thing that will help. You embody what you're infilled with to share, so that a sudden shift of perception can occur, and healing, an experience of time collapsed, can occur. So that it doesn't take years to change, or years to refine your soul to a better, pure place. So, that was the second thing I wanted to share. So let's go to the book. Question.
As we see with these new eyes facing the altar and seeing the Christ, we are also seeing ourselves as the expression of the Father. When I see and make the distinction in another who is afar, George W. Bush, Saddam Hussein, where is the healing? Is it just one more person seeing the truth? How do we observe a healing?
How do we
observe the healing from afar? I only say that in perspective, in that we're not going to wake up the next morning and see a change in behavior.
To love, there is no distance.
Okay, but with my partner, I can see something more clearly, maybe, than I can with the individuals you've.
Well, let me put it this way. Tests have been made, and it has been shown that a plant that is on a table in your own house, that you give loving attention to, that you, if you just sit there and look at it, appreciating it, it responds. And if that plant is taken 30 miles or 100 miles away, and you sit in your house and think exactly the same loving thoughts about it, it responds as though it were in your house. Don't you believe for a moment that your expression of love toward Christ George Bush or Christ Saddam Hussein isn't felt? We've talked before about the fact that there are no private thoughts. We talked about waging peace.